All right, wonderful. It seems like we have an excellent group today. So it's my pleasure to call to order the second meeting of the MIT IDE seminar series. We've got an amazing lineup this semester that is now fully booked. Look for next week where we'll have Jared Cowen of Google Jigsaw here. And Eric, I wanted to make a note, is very sorry he couldn't make it to see your presentation. He is attending his mother's memorial service in California. But today we have the great Tyler Cowen. I'm sure that the reason we have such a great showing here is because so many of you are, like me, fans of his podcast or his blog or his books, or maybe you're just going to ask him for a better grade in your course at George Mason. Personally, I've read his blog for nearly daily for about 5 years. Judging by this, I seem to have missed his point about not being too complacent. But I feel like by inviting you here and getting the blog directly face-to-face, I've overcome this great stagnation I've had. So the presentation day is completely booked. I know some people were unfortunately not able to make it. I was super surprised that we didn't immediately get a secondary market in reselling these registrations, so maybe not markets in absolutely everything. That being said, we were a bit disappointed about Tyler coming today because we had originally invited his evil brother Tyrone. Tyrone unfortunately said he can't leave Tyler's house because he's afraid if he ever leaves the attic, Tyler will change the lock. So we just get Tyler today. And so in any case, I'll now leave you in the hands of a man who is underrated at any evaluation. Tyler, please give us your trippy presentation.
Thank you all for coming. I'm very honored to be here. When it comes to the internet, I'm not really a researcher the way many of you are. I think of myself as a practitioner. So this will be very much a practitioner's talk, even though my profession is that of a researcher. Intellectually, I live on the internet. And like many talks of practitioners, this one has a biographical origin, as I show in the first slide here. So carrying around phantoms and demons is advice I typically give to my students. So when I teach them, obviously I'm trying to teach them some content, but most of all I'm trying to teach them to have what I call the phantom Tyler Cowen on their shoulder. So when they go through life or encounter other problems, they can consult the phantom Tyler Cowen, because the real Tyler Cowen won't be there. They could email the real Tyler Cowen. But it's very useful to have a phantom of someone on your shoulder to respond to what ideas you might have. So I'll come away from my day today with the phantom MIT internet group on my shoulder. And basically different people I meet, I develop mental models of them, and I carry them around like phantoms and demons. And I find this one of the very best ways of learning or educating myself or staying fresh. There's a big literature on how you should try to estimate variables you don't know, and relying on the opinions of other people often is very useful. It can be better than your own most of the time. You want some kind of weighted average of other opinions and so on. But unlike in James Surowiecki's The Wisdom of Crowds, you can't always poll everyone on how much does that ox weigh and take the actual weighted average. What you need to do is consult the phantoms and demons on your shoulder. People who blog often talk about Twitter like it's some kind of new horror. Like, my goodness, they've done away with us. They have this evil, low-quality simulation running around, and you even have to wonder, what's going to be the next thing to replace Twitter. So I think the idea that science, what we want to do is push it back to the Platonic ideal of how we think about science as following some kind of scientific method. That can all be well and true, but we still need to deal with these out-of-control simulations, which are controlled by quite distinct processes of spontaneous order, and they're kind of running the show. And this was Baudrillard's main point, that once you start simulations, they tend to become the real thing. And Baudrillard even asked, well, people start confusing the simulation with the real thing, or they start wondering, is the real thing actually a simulation? So you mentioned before, like, me is coming here like I'm the blog. Like, is the blog the simulation of me, or am I the simulation of the blog? I think I'm actually the simulation of the blog. There's a lot of new ways of doing simulations we've invented. So one, I guess I find it useful, again, opinions may vary, but WhatsApp, which is now run by Facebook, You just have a few people you know, typically a very small number for it to work, and you shoot them out a question, and they bat it back and forth for, I don't know, it can be less than a minute, and then it's over. Like Twitter, a debate could go on for days, and you're tired of it. You block, you mute, whatever. I mean, WhatsApp, there are people you know and trust, and you get feedback in 40 seconds, and then you move on to the next thing. It's not public, which is itself interesting. Maybe that's like a new form of simulation. So kind of the good and the bad news, I guess I think it's good news. You have competing simulations. So you have a new idea. Do you put it on your blog? Do you put it on Twitter? Do you like query people on WhatsApp? And there's a competitive process. I suppose optimally you'll be using some combination of those things. But insofar as, say, Twitter has drawbacks, like maybe there's certain things you can't say on Twitter. People will jump on you, call you evil. So that might be an idea you discuss on WhatsApp and so on. But again, that's the case of simulations taking over. There is at least one example I know of where it seems some kind of simulation has literally taken over the profession, and that's some parts of physics. I was speaking to some people. They told me about how working papers really have displaced journals as where ideas are discussed, and it's quicker, and they all tell me it's better. I don't know much about this, but a few people told me this. Seems to me it's true. They seem to have really a very good version of a simulation, which still has a lot of thoughtfulness behind it, but has managed to be quicker. Now, you know, a big issue today, it's become especially discussed because of recent events. But the simple question, like any economist who's read Harold Demsetz will, of course, ask very quickly, should simulations be owned or should they be open source? Somehow, no one actually asked this question. So in the good old days when blogging was the main simulation, say that's 2006, 2007, through about 2012 maybe, it was quite open source. So there was Google Reader. Google Reader, of course, was owned by Google. But basically, individuals would own their blogs, and there would be decentralized communication, and no one owned the whole thing. That had big advantages, common advantages of decentralized systems, easy entry. You could design things any way you want. You would compete for readers. It had a lot of disadvantages, some of which were significant. Since nothing is owned, the incentives for quality were highly varied. You might think there was a blog attached to a reputation. The reputation is like being owned. That was a partial incentive. But still, if the value of your blog dropped to zero, like who cares? It was kind of zero to begin with for a lot of people. Obviously, that didn't always favor quality. Some of these problems were quite trivial. Like I remember the days when people would complain about trackback spam on blogs. It's one of these old tech things, like everyone has forgotten. It's like complaining about how your 8-track tapes would work. In 1974, when it would switch tracks, there'd be a punching sound, like in the middle of your favorite Beatles song, and this was a terrible thing. But it was a reflection of problems with decentralized systems. It's easy to attack them with spam, either literal spam or spam in a broader sense, just a lot of bad ideas. And I think what beat out the blog-based simulation, part of it was Twitter, but also Facebook. And Facebook, of course, is a walled garden. It's very much owned. We know who and which company owns it. And Facebook imposed very definite new rules on this entire process of simulating and transmitting scientific ideas. And we've moved from the unowned network to the owned network. And I suppose I very much prefer the unowned network, myself not being the person who owns Facebook. And maybe you don't think of Facebook as where scientific ideas get transmitted, but I can assure you it is to really a quite significant degree. First, there's what people in government or decision-making positions may get from Facebook directly. That's probably significant, but I don't even think that's the main effect. So if you look at a website, say like Vox.com or the New York Times, which really do transmit ideas to policymakers, ideas about science, whether or not you always agree, they are of major importance. If you ask, like, who, what, or which thing are they targeting with their content, really to a very large degree, they are targeting Facebook. So Facebook is like the tail wagging the dog. Even if no senator ever visits his or her Facebook page before deciding how to vote, may well be the case, Facebook has this enormous pull on the entire simulation of science because everyone is courting this mass audience that Facebook has assembled. So it's worth asking, like, what is it that Facebook has done well, the owned simulation, that the unowned simulation didn't do well at all? And there's a whole bunch of things. There's the trivial things like, oh, no trackback spam. But I picked that example precisely because it's kind of stupid and trivial, and I know a lot of you haven't heard of it. I think the really valuable thing Facebook did is it somehow motivated people to be involved much better than the decentralized network did. So Google Reader, Google stopped Google Reader. They just stopped it. I don't think it cost them that much. It just was not a product priority. It was viewed as a failure for other readers. None of them have in any way evolved to be major firms. Their costs are low. We all kind of widely assume some number of these readers will continue into the future. It's a thing that will exist, but it's not a platform that seems to have a lot of dynamic evolutionary potential. Most people just are not that motivated by an RSS feed or something like an RSS feed. Even Twitter, which we think of as quote-unquote a big deal, it's really quite tiny compared to Facebook in terms of, say, driving media traffic, or where actual living, breathing, walking humans get their ideas from. It's Facebook, not Twitter, even though we're probably a very Twitter-intense crowd. Twitter is more for intellectuals and some other groups. So Facebook's supplying motivation. It's like there's this infrastructure behind any simulation, and Facebook made the simulation far more profitable than it ever had been before. So there's so much talk about Facebook now, but I really see very little talk. How is the existence of Facebook shaped science? It just seems to me that's a very important question. One goal in my talk is just to get you all thinking about this. The election, privacy, whatever, fine, but the replacement of the unwalled decentralized garden by Facebook, how has it changed the simulation? As far as I can tell, is a quite under-investigated question, at least by outsiders. So given that Facebook has motivated people, it's a much bigger network than any of the previous networks, like through RSS or what we have now in Twitter. It seems Facebook has motivated people by putting them in touch with their friends. That's why they call it Facebook. Very simple observation, but maybe we need to think it through more. So if the transmission of social, scientific, economic information is intermediated, I won't even call it by friendship. Dare I call it a simulation of friendship? Or maybe it too becomes the real thing. That's the real friendship, and you meet someone that's kind of like a simulation of your Facebook relationship or your Twitter relationship. Again, which is the real person. I don't know. But the idea that simulated friendship intermediates which information is profitable, what kinds of information are complements to simulated friendship, that seems to me to be the major force driving what gets picked up from science. Again, other than the separate technocratic channel of things passed directly to agencies and the like. Say what gets sent to NASA, probably Facebook has a much smaller role in that. But a lot of economic policy really is coming through the media, coming through the public sphere. And again, the ruling principle there will be which ideas are complements to simulated friendship. Who would have thought that? It's not as weird as CryptoKitties and 1,000 different coins, but it's pretty weird, right? So one interesting feature of simulations, it's I sent weird slides on purpose because it's a weird topic. I want to get people into the mindset of weird. We're living in this deeply weird world that rather quickly has become to seem kind of normal, but is much weirder than we realize for what ideas get transmitted. And we're running this unusual experiment that no one really decided upon. I'm not pessimistic about it, and I'm not an anti-Facebook person, but when people say, oh, we all need to start talking about, what they really mean is they want to start dumping on a company, an idea, practice. I don't mean it that way at all. I really just would like to encourage people to think through much more what it means when your simulation is owned. If you're living in a simulation, as some cosmologists have suggested, do you want to be living in an owned or an unowned simulation? I think most people at first say, oh, I want to be living in an owned simulation. Probably that's the right answer. It'll have better rules. but there's also a higher chance you might be tortured if you're living in an owned simulation. And you know, the cosmological argument, like once you have beings at all who can simulate, in that equilibrium there are so many more simulations than real things. So looking back in Bayesian terms, like you're here, you feel conscious, what should you think is your chance of being real rather than simulated? It's very easy to write down a few numbers and think, oh my God, I'm a simulation, like my chance of being real is 1 in a billion. I'm not convinced by that argument, but I feel if I debated against it, I would lose the debate because I don't have a better counter response. But again, it just gets to this idea of taking simulations seriously. I think Facebook competes with WhatsApp, and for that matter, Instagram, Facebook the service, even though they're all owned by Facebook the company. This is one thing that makes me optimistic. So if you think of Facebook the company as owning various other services, including WhatsApp and Instagram, to forestall competition, a lot of people worry about that. I understand why. But the way they forestall competition is by keeping those services relatively close to what a competitor might enter the market with. So as long as I have a user of either putting my dialogue on Facebook or putting it on WhatsApp, not to mention blogs, Twitter, other things not owned by Facebook, the company, that to me feels pretty competitive. And the fact that in Menlo Park they're both owned by the same corporate structure, at least what we've seen so far, it does not seem to be diminishing that competition. The incentive is not for Facebook to make WhatsApp like Facebook the service. And then again, for scientific purposes, you get more competition than it looks like. So if you think about social media, what are all the different methods for transmission? So a lot of claims now, well, Facebook has a lot of market power, even though it's not price-reflected market power. I'm not sure. So my social networks, they're like actually meeting people, which I've done today, believe it or not. There's Twitter. There's my blog, which for me has been a tremendous method of social networking. It's like drive to a big chunk of my career. There's just email. There's texting people, which only today I learned how to do, I should add. I know how to answer text. I didn't know how to text you until today. I think I learned. There's like your email directory. There's actually the good old telephone. Is Facebook really a monopoly ideologically as a social network? I'm not sure. I don't know what's the right measure of like the market, but it may be somewhat less of a monopoly than many people think, especially when you see within the garden Instagram and WhatsApp as having to compete with Facebook the service as opposed to Facebook the company. So far I'm actually a relative optimist on simulations remaining a competitive process, which is not to say competition always will get you the result you want. A related discussion I've been having lately, some very different direction, but I think it ties together. I did an interview with a philosopher from Chicago named Agnes Callard. It's not out yet, but it will be in the podcast. She and I talked about this. She wrote a paper asking why do philosophers seek to refute each other? And at first it seems like a weird question. It's like, why is giving a seminar at University of Chicago, why does everyone want to refute you? But I think it's actually a profound question we don't have an answer for. It's evolved as a method. In a way, it's like simulating a longer run professional debate that you would have in journals with responses and citations. But you show up at a seminar. In philosophy, the method is very much one of refutation. Someone tries to pick a hole in your argument, like the way Gary Becker used to at Chicago. If you think most ideas are kind of wrong, or maybe like not that relevant, most ideas in academia, maybe they're not flat out wrong. But if you think most ideas are not valuable, it seems refuting is an odd method. Like you're making them look worse when the presumption is already they're worthless. In a simple economic model, that seems like the wrong way to go. So I asked Agnes in this dialogue, what about looking to how the private sector does things? In private sector meetings, you will see debates or people trying to refute each other. But I think more common is you come out of a meeting agreeing to like put together a small team to solve an actual problem. And if someone puts forward an idea, very often the incentive is not to refute the idea, but to say something that will make the idea better. So I said, why don't philosophers structure their seminars where someone says something kind of by norm. No one's allowed to try to refute it, since everyone's already assuming it's worthless, right, rationally. And three people get to speak to try to make the idea better. And then at the end, everyone walks away, just scratches their head, and they ponder, well, did we get this idea over the bar or not? Why aren't things done that way? That's another way of running the simulation. So there's adversarial methods in science, different ways seminars are organized. Again, you can think of them all as running simulations. I think of seminars as kind of unowned simulations, but with strong norms. So kind of MIT is owned. You could say MIT owns the simulation. But they're not like posing very strict rules. There are norms you all have, like how often people interrupt, who gets to interrupt the most, like what's the proper tone when you interrupt and so on. Presumably those norms are holding here. And just to think about, like, those are all simulations too, and like how owned should they be. There are seminars with very strict rules. If you go to a Liberty Fund seminar, which I think those are very well run, but they have an exact number of people, and Mr. Goodrich, the philanthropist, designed a table that he thought was the right size for people having a seminar, not too long, not too short. This table is a bit too long, not that I want any of you in the back not to be here, but like ideally if we could change the dimensions of the universe so you could be 40% closer, this would be a better conversation. So again, how discussions occur is the same issue. Now, to get to a kind of controversial part of the talk, ask the simple question, can we make science better by making it worse? So to go back to the outraged bloggers when they're displaced by Twitter, the bloggers felt like they were scientific, and they're mad when something that appears to be less scientific comes along. The researchers feel they're more scientific. They are, of course, more scientific than blogs. Maybe some are upset when blogs become the way their content is intermediated toward the world. I got into a lot of discussions on this. I was just 2 weeks ago at a seminar for 2 full days on how can we make science better. And it was striking to me that all of the academics in particular, every single one, people went on at great length with ideas for making science higher quality. So, like we should have maybe double-blind refereeing in fields where we don't already have it. We should require greater transparency, negative results to be published, registers of different trials so people could look at the whole space of information. You know, a lot of good ideas. I think a lot of them could be done very cheaply. I'm really not opposed to any of them. Probably I'm for all of them. But the striking thing to me about these kind of talks, and I've been to a whole bunch of them, is that you will never hear academics come up with a proposal for making science in some ways worse. And if you look at real-world innovation, it so often proceeds that at least initially you make something worse. You may in the long run end up with something that's better. But let me just give you a simple example. Food innovation. If I ask myself, like, what's some of the best food I've eaten in my life? I once wrote a book about a village in Mexico, and I did field work there. And I went to the village. At that time, a family of 7 would have a per capita income of about $1,500. 30, 40 years earlier, people in the village, like, literally might starve to death, or just to a point where it was an extreme problem for them. And I showed up at the village, and I asked for food. The variance of quality in the food was high, but the best things they had were remarkable. They'd say to me, well, would you like some fish? My first trip, I was naive. Oh, yes, I'd like some fish. And they're like, great, we'll go down to the river and catch it for you. And I was hungry. I mean, I was very hungry. And, 3 hours later, maybe 2 hours, they'd come back with the fish. It was amazing, right? Freshly cooked. It had other virtues, ambiance of eating the fish. But that's not really a successful food innovation, is it? Like the important food innovations, some of them have made food worse. Now, in the long run, by making food worse, we made society wealthier, and we produced this network of restaurants this village doesn't have. And I have this amazing choice, Sichuan chili peppers, things they don't have in the village. But look, McDonald's in some ways made food worse. It made it better compared to some diners. In other ways, it made it worse. And a lot of internet innovation proceeds by, in part, actually making things partly worse, at least at first. Early Amazon, there's some Amazon people here. At the beginning, it wasn't actually that great. Like I was hopeful. It's far exceeded my expectations. But here's some like wag online describing early Amazon, and I quote, like here's their business model. Amazon, quote, will sell books online even though users are still scared to use credit cards on the web. Their shipping costs will eat up any money they save. They'll do it for the convenience even though they have to wait a week for the book. Early description of Amazon. Early description, maybe still current, LinkedIn, may still be current. LinkedIn, quote, how about a professional social network aimed at busy 30 to 40-somethings? They will use it once every 5 years when they go job searching. Doesn't sound like a huge winner. It's been successful. Twitter, quote, it's like email, SMS, or RSS, which, by the way, has kind of failed, except it only has 140 characters, now 280. Doesn't support images, that's changed. Can't be made private. With DM, that's different too. And will be used mostly by geeks at first, followed by Britney Spears and Charlie Sheen. So there's a category of innovation. American homes are another example. If you talk to people who love architecture, you will commonly hear the view, and I fully admit this is subjective, but you will hear the view that the best American homes, as pictured here, were made between something like 1910 and 1930, and there are whole neighborhoods of these in St. Louis and Chicago, Detroit, many places, Boston, of course, and that they're beautiful, and you look at what is built today, and on the outside, it's hideous. I'm not sure we as researchers can judge this, but the fact that so many experts in the field think it's true is noteworthy. There's really no one who says, like, oh, the best computer was made in 1917, and the ones today are just junk. There are people who say that about, say, music. So it seems there are fields where innovation proceeds, like music. The 3-minute song replaces the symphony. You might think that the 3-minute song is worse. Maybe it is worse, but it's more convenient. So the idea that a lot of the logic of innovation is partly making things worse, not in all dimensions, but like this home, this is from St. Louis. I was in a home like this not long ago, what I think the same neighborhood. It looks much better than my newer home, but I'm pretty sure my newer home in some ways has a better interior, more conveniences, kind of the appendages on the outside, with skilled labor and carpentry that now would be very expensive. Like the newer homes are better, all things considered. It's why we changed. But in part with homes, we innovated by making them worse. So thinking about science, I mean, the contrarian in me can't help but raise the question, are there some ways in which how we make science better should be making it worse? I've never heard an academic who liked this idea because it lowers the status of academia. And are simulations in some ways maybe making science better by making it worse? You don't even have to think this is true on net, but I guess that's where this question leads. Is possibly a reason to celebrate some of the simulations? And of course they're worse. But nonetheless, worse innovations have done pretty well lately, and something like the internet, in the ways that early on it was worse, we ended up being better off. There's a paper.
Question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I haven't read your blog or whatever. I'm catching that you're in a way you tend not to want to be very judgmental about any simulations. Is that right? I mean, you sort of want to let all simulations, live their 1,000 lives and whatever. Let science get worse for a while so it gets better. Let politics get worse for a while so it gets better. I'm just trying to understand, do you have any judgment on it? Are there sort of norms they should follow? Are there reasons to restrict or to think about?
That's a very good question. I would say my tone or mood and my conclusions are very different.
Okay.
So when people approach a lot of topics, especially outside of what you'd call the narrowly scientific world, they tend to be too judgmental. And one of the ideas I very explicitly promote on my blog is the fact people should be less judgmental, so that you pick this up exactly corresponds to something. But that said, if at the end, we can decide something, I'm happy with imposing that judgment. But I want to enter it, especially a topic where people who do science tend to dislike simulations of what they do. So especially here, like the simulations are at a disadvantage. And I want to encourage, you know, the Phantom Tyler Cowen, this non-judgmental. But I don't think we should conclude it's all fine, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean, that remains to be seen. We might conclude that. Yes, Buck?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by worse. All your examples are, you know, it used to be worse and it got better.
Social welfare.
No, you started with Amazon. So, you know, when Amazon started out, they only had books and maybe it took a week to get the book.
Right.
So they just started.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly Amazon, when it first started, was worse than Amazon is today.
Right.
And all your examples are like that. You know, houses maybe were worse. They didn't have the means they are today, more expensive and so on. I understand. You're not making something worse. You're making something and it gets better.
But there are Lancastrian, what you might call Q dimensions, where new innovations are in some critical ways worse than the older product. And that's part of why they succeed, that you get more convenience, some of the Q characteristics being worse, and then you get a takeoff effect. That's what I mean by worse. For me it was, absolutely. It depends where you would live, but for a large percentage of consumers in this country, I think it was just flat out worse.
Really? Then you don't have to use Amazon. Go to the bookstore.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
And if they're worse, I don't understand the worse. Why Amazon was worse when they started selling books.
Or take the homes example. Many newer homes are a net more convenient, they're cheaper, but they look worse. So there's a Q dimension where you make the product worse to make it more convenient.
You are or not a fan of methodological individualism?
Sure, absolutely.
Some people like modern homes. They like modern looking homes. Some people like older homes. Older homes can be very expensive. Why don't you look at the price as a measure of the value instead of you think it worse? The old home is worse than the new home, vice versa.
Well, but this is looking at the price, the implicit shadow price of the different Q characteristics. Some of those are falling because it's getting worse. Don't just look at the price of the bundle, right? So the fish I ate in this village, the time waiting price was horrible. The taste price was amazing. I basically am willing to give that up for worse fish that is served to me in, 13 minutes at a Boston seafood restaurant. But clearly that one price within the Lancastrian bundle, it's worse. Like you can measure those.
Very quickly to your point, there's a software I say called Worse is Better.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I've seen Unix 1 because they were good enough to buy the product.
Yeah. Yes.
I just want to go back for a second to your example of Amazon using a fish example.
Yes.
So if Amazon was I understand it was worse for you,
Mm-hmm.
but it must have been better for enough people.
Sure, of course. It was more convenient for people who, unlike me, did not live next to a Borders. To give one simple
so
reason.
there must have been more people like them than like you. Otherwise,
It doesn't have to be more. It may or may not be more, but that's part of the neat trick. It just has to be enough.
so it's on the whole, for the group, it was better, not worse.
Well, over time, it definitely was better.
Even on the first day, otherwise they wouldn't use it, right?
You have diversity of consumers, right? You pick up some part of that diversity to cover your fixed costs, and you build something better, which ultimately is a platform. But early on, the relative balance of better and worse, you can debate. It can go either way.
But as a group, if the whole group are now,
Yeah.
it couldn't possibly even succeed to the next stage to get better. It was worse for the group as a whole.
Again, if you have fixed costs, because a single period social welfare analysis can go either way. So it could have been just flat out worse. I don't think it really matters for what we're talking about, but just like as a technical point, they're making an investment. Clearly the multi-period case, Amazon is an amazing benefit, and that it survived and grown shows that. But first period alone can go either way, I think. Yeah, Bob.
I'm sorry to delay. The problem is you're claiming that they purposely made it worse in order to make it.
No, not purposely. They did what they could. They did what they could. They said convenience above all else. The other pieces of this puzzle, some will be worse at first because we can't make them better. But purposiveness doesn't enter into it one way or the other. Online education, which is the teaching of science, it's not the doing of science. But when you ask, there's obviously projects at MIT. There's my own project called mruniversity.com. I think it's an interesting question in online education. How much are you trying to make it better? And how much, to the extent it succeeds, are you willing to let some parts of it be worse simply because it's more convenient? And one great advantage of online education is simply that it can be free and very convenient, especially at the mobile level. Some features of it clearly are worse than a live teacher. Some features clearly are better. So you can replay. It's always there at your disposal. You can speed up, how quickly it goes. You can pause. Curves can be shifted in different ways that a live teacher is going to find harder to do.
I just want to stress this is why I asked the methodological individualism question. Because the fact of the matter is, for the non-trivial number of people, I'm not speaking for MIT at large, the live teacher is inherently worse. It's inherently worse.
The word inherently makes me nervous. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just not sure what you mean.
Some people are of a personality type or learning type.
Mm-hmm.
The bundle, where live teaching is inherently worse.
Sure.
So the Salman Khan approach will inherently be better. So I think that one of the issues people have, certainly that I have, is that when you say is worse, for whom? For whom?
Sure, of course.
And that's what I'd like to. What is your discriminator on this between worse? When you say for whom?
That some key characteristics of the new product, the new and ultimately better product, will be of lower value, possibly for even all customers.
That's the question. So
it doesn't have to literally be all, but it could be all. It certainly may be a large number of them, and yet the thing still will succeed. And that this is a common feature of progress, and it might be a feature of progress in science. Another paper I've been studying lately, I find intriguing. Probably many of you know this piece by Bloom, Jones, von Reenen, and Michael Webb. Their idea is that you have to throw more and more scientists at a project, even to get constant results, and that scientific progress is slowing down. They have a lot of measurements, but what I'm struck by is one of their measurements. To keep the rate of scientific progress constant in the model, you need to double the number of scientists you throw at a problem every 13 years. I think that's more significant than they think it is. So you could say, well, this is happening because science is becoming more bureaucratized, or we're hitting harder problems. There's, I think, clearly some truth to that, but it seems to me that cannot be the whole story. Science is not becoming more bureaucratized at that rapid a rate. Like things now compared to 13 years ago, whatever complaints you might have, they don't seem to be that much worse. You have to double the number of scientists you throw at a problem. So I suspect what's going on in their model is the main failure is not coming from the side of the scientists. The main failure is coming from the side of the non-scientists. So take someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who's not a scientist. He did something highly innovative. If we restrict Mark Zuckerberg to whatever means we might do, it could be legal, it could just be cultural, it could be the space of internet innovation is filled out. It doesn't matter. Just like there's some kind of exogenous restriction on the non-scientific innovators, it seems to me that is more likely to account for this kind of result. If you're combining non-scientific and scientific innovators, we're not getting that much worse, even if you think we're getting worse. And I'm not even sure we are, that we could account for needing to double us every 13 years. So it must be like the real failure is in the
oligopolistic billionaires.
Somewhere else, right? Doesn't have to be not enough Mark Zuckerbergs, but some other part of the system. And we, like in our what is now governed by the simulation, are maybe doing fine. This doesn't prove we're doing fine. This is a different way of framing what the problem is. And maybe what we've been doing is to make up for whatever the other failures may be. We're putting in more scientists as a substitute for the low productivity of the other unobserved factors. And so it looks like we're terrible. But maybe this is a way of thinking about why it's not the productivity of the scientists. Yes?
I'm pretty sure Cowen work was precisely.
Oh, please tell me the citation. What is it?
Cowen at HBS, he's doing competitions to solve problems.
Okay.
and putting it out to the crowd, and people with no scientific degree have potentially the best results.
Okay, I'll look into that. Thank you. Just takeaways, other than just like weirdness. So the main takeaway is like weird demon on the shoulder, but first, like simulations are everywhere, something we should think about more. Second, simulations, whether we like it or not, they can beat perfectionism. Doesn't mean they're better for the world, but just in a competitive environment, very often the simulations win, and the so-called worst, quote unquote, not my judgment, but the so-called worst simulations can beat what are supposedly the better simulations. Three, simulations are dangerous. We just don't understand these processes very well. Does the first welfare theorem apply? I can't build an argument to show you that, so let's just, worry about it. What happens on social media is more serious than you think. It kind of feels like I don't need to say this these days. I'm still a social media optimist. I'm what you'd call broadly, pro-Facebook, even though it's not the main thing I use. But nonetheless, how social media have an influence on science, far more serious than we think. I think in part because scientists tend to be in denial about the simulation, kind of displacing and or augmenting them. We don't understand how social media shapes simulations very well. Science policy faces many issues here, and I don't mainly mean the government, but just how seminars, how universities, how social media networks regulate, govern what they do. What you do with blogs, what you do on Twitter. It's all come so quickly, not received that much serious thought. They seem to me to be really major issues of science policy, internet policy. You don't have to think of this as governmental. A lot of it's about norms. And at least consider, maybe, like at some margins, the way to make science better is actually to make it worse. And let's not just talk about greater transparency and more trials and publication of this and that, but what can we do that is like the Boston seafood restaurant serving us the fish in 13 minutes and not being quite as good as it is in my Mexican village home. Anyway, there's still time for questions. Thank you all for coming. This is not a paper. It's maybe a simulation of a paper. Thank you all.
So thank you.
Sorry.
You might already address it. Can you give one example of what would science look like?
Here's two examples, say from Twitter. And you can debate if it's better or worse, but it makes a difference. So there are emotional memes on Twitter that spread quite readily. And one of them is, there's some tragic problem out there, and good people simply need to rise together and do something about it. It's a very common Twitter meme. You'll see replicated millions of times. So when people are discussing monetary policy, I found the Phillips curve is much more popular on Twitter than it is in the research literature. And the Phillips curve over the course of the recovery kind of implies the Fed could have done more to re-employ people at a quicker rate. So insofar as Twitter, blogs, or the simulation, the Phillips curve has become more popular than it would have been had it simply been slugged out in the journals. Now, I don't want to go through the whole debate here and judge whether that's better or worse. My personal view is it's made the debate worse. But again, you could argue maybe the Twitter view is more correct. Another example would be the debate over fiscal austerity. Like, what's the size of the multiplier had the European Union done more government spending during its years of crisis? On Twitter and on blogs, there's a tendency to exaggerate more than in published papers. So you get an exaggerated view, some people saying the multiplier is very high, and then maybe fiscal conservatives really dumping on the idea of fiscal policy, and either the multiplier is low or there's some other reason why, no, don't do that, use monetary policy. You get the same result, but more cheaply. And a lot of debates, like just one side wins, whether it's the correct side or not. And when the debate is on Twitter, the winning side tends to be more exaggerated. So I would say, again, whether or not you agree, in the EU, the Austerians lost the public debate, and the people advocating more stimulus won the public debate, again, whether or not you agree. So we've ended up with a more exaggerated sense of how well fiscal policy would have worked than what we would have had we conducted the debate more slowly in journals. But of course, a slower debate we'd still be having, and the debate on Twitter, was up and running on day one, and we kept on rehashing it. But it was done very, very quickly on Twitter and blogs. So those would be two examples where it makes a difference. And, you're entitled to your own opinion on better or worse, but no way is always going to work out for the better, right?
So those examples work.
You get a quick answer, and that quick answer is readily communicated to people making the actual decisions. It's also the case there are narrowly scientific advantages to using blog Twitter. So it can increase your professional rewards. It can increase the size of your personal network. It can get graduate students interested in your work. You can put out a query about databases. Kind of the narrow scientific uses are still there, and they can be quite important. But the big use is simply an answer is produced. It's produced right away, and everyone is paying attention.
So you get a poisoned fish faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Just like in the Boston seafood restaurant. It's exactly what you get. Yes.
It's happened many times in the past, though. Like, you got a physicist in here, they say the expansion of the natural sciences and the social sciences, for example, studying the scope of science, but made it worse in terms of replication, professionalization of science, the rise of corporate science. These are all things that, by certain traditional quality measures, made science worse,
Sure.
but also had other advantages.
Sure, absolutely. Yes.
On your question about whether
Yeah.
whether simulations should be or protocols should be owned or unowned,
Mm-hmm.
and the trade-off there, there's this notion, and I'd love to get your take on it. You're probably familiar with that we can get the kind of the best of both worlds with kind of economic incentives and organized blockchain protocols. Is that something that makes sense to you? That the economic incentives can be right for people to invest in the thing, but not other people.
I have a whole talk on this, and I'm doing some of it next week. It's a huge topic. I think the chance that tokens pay off big time is 10 or 20%, but if they do, it will be wonderful. My best guess is that there's not something really there, but even explaining why would take a very long time, and my kind of simulated answer is I'm not sure. Ask Twitter, see what they say. But it's a very good question. Yes?
So how certain are you that you want to be consider that last slide, which I look at, I see that as being maybe about cost of using science, right? So how certain are you that we don't take this as until in cost of innovation when we just as a species stop?
Again, I'm uncertain. I'm definitely of the view we've had a productivity slowdown both since 1973 and since 1999. I've written a lot on that. I think we're still in it. The last productivity number I saw was 1.1 quarterly, to be sure, but it hasn't been great for a while. It's not just one data point. I don't think it will ever be zero, but I think one reason simulations have multiplied is precisely because the real thing is slowing down, and people feel they need to do something, and you can innovate much more easily in what you'd call cyberspace than you can in the, the so-called real world. And we've seen that massive substitution. So Facebook and all these gardens have grown way more rapidly than like the physical infrastructure of science. Yes?
I'm going to offer you an example. I think what you're saying is science in social science in particular, where the introduction of statistical methods sort of an emphasis on p-values, and then we went through this period where there's p-hacking going on, and possibly the results from that period are worse than the results before these methods. And now I think we're entering a period in which the rigor which these things are done is much.
That's consistent with my observations. You get, of course, your own version of p-hacking in the simulations. It's not even like measured, but basically every hypothesis is put forward, every prediction is put forward. Those who predict well are rewarded. That's a dangerous kind of p-hacking in the simulation. There's always someone on Twitter saying, X will happen, and then they seem all of a sudden really smart. So we're batting down on it in one part of the space, and it's growing in the other. Yes?
No one wants to suggest that we should make works to get better. It's not one of the suggestions that the topics are talking about. That's making it less egalitarian, so that it becomes more legal. People with the most resources say that.
I see. So, it's a very good question. I was just talking about this before the seminar with some people. Economics, which of course I know best, I see as becoming much less egalitarian. So one scale is what data can you get access to. The old days were a publicly available database, sort of anyone could run stuff on. That doesn't have cachet anymore. It's sort of all been done. So how can you get data? How does Raj Chetty get his data? I mean, let's just say it's hard, and it depends on social connections. Setting up RCTs depends on fundraising skills. Top research is done more in teams. This is in a lot of sciences, of course, not just economics. So project management is a bigger skill. So you need to be a great researcher and a great project manager. Indeed, Chetty is, right? It's part of the Raj Chetty production function. But the more we require of people negotiating the bureaucracy, the narrower you make those who can get through. And the kind of jerky kid who could run like two-stage least squares on a publicly available database in the 70s and maybe actually have something interesting relative to where we were before, totally done. Can that same person like assemble a team and set up something in Uganda and manage the process and raise the money and see the thing through IRBs and keep the co-authors on board? Like, my goodness, this is kind of the new billionaires game, but it's all about management skill and social connections. Now, in the other part, in the simulation, that's a funny mix of super egalitarian and super not egalitarian. Like, really, if you're not banned, anyone can go on Twitter and you're there. But on the other hand, does anyone listen to you? There's a lot of papers like Power Law on Twitter, Power Law of blogs. That too is extremely unequal. But like, you do have a voice. And I think if you had a brilliant tweet with a small number of followers, like, it will get retweeted a lot. So it could be a kind of efficient power law. Like, stuff gets out. If you have something to say on Twitter, it tends to be picked up, I think. Yes?
So I'm wondering if some of the dimensions by which you could say science has become, like preprints on archive, or the fact that some of the NVDR working paper series actually not.
Absolutely.
There's something endogenous about the value of the research with respect to cost of producing it and how long the feedback cycles are. So one way you could get a free lunch, so to speak, would be to increase reviewers cycle times, decrease reviewer cycle times, get more of that going, incentivizing that, then you wouldn't have the need for preprints as much, or you do these sorts of things.
I favor that kind of reform. I just don't think it will matter what much. So the core institutional failure is there's not the ability to fully protect property rights and ideas. So once you have something, you have an incentive to put it out in some kind of working paper form, sort of quicker than you ought to. And then once it's out, the incentive for a media outlet to write it up and be the first. Those time periods, they're so short that if we get like referees from 4 months to 2, again, I'm all for it. But I think the other processing steps are going to happen so instantaneously. We're basically in the same mess.
That's making it worse for me. Those examples are making it worse for people. It's coming too soon.
Yes, we hope it ends up being better, but we see the getting worse part. Yes.
That's an example.
Yes. Now, the long-run effect might be if everyone knows this is the game, like once you have an NBER paper, the whole world reads and evaluates it, and Twitter tries to pick it apart, the kinds of effort you put in to begin with, kinds of people you recruit, one hopes, will be better than in the absence of this. Yes?
Can I ask just kind of a clarifying question? So you're using the word simulation a lot, and it seems a lot of the time it's a synonym for alternative communication norms or alternative communication media. So why is it okay if I just insert, alternative communication norms in my head whenever I see simulation, or what does that miss?
It's a phonier, cheaper, and quicker fake version of the quote-unquote real thing. That's a simulation. So you play a video game, like it's like a simulation of an actual star battle, right? Or you play a board game, Avalon Hill, simulation of a World War II battle. They're way cheaper, safer, quicker, right? World War II took a while. There are clear reasons to do them. There are also clear reasons why they're dangerous, and the costs and benefits are very tightly linked. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering to what extent they make the communication media and the simulation, or the cheapening of quality of everything, in the sense that, I've kind of had this idea in my head for a while that we increase the speed of communication, right? You sort of breeding more intelligence. But maybe what we're doing is removing the filter that favored rationality at the expense of our animal instincts.
Of course.
And so, to some extent, by increasing the speed of communication medium, are you sometimes inherently cheapening that quality? Or if there's an optimistic view, is that there's this fast process that cheapens, but a slower process that will eventually overtake?
And the other side of that to think about is the new simulation, whether it's Twitter, Facebook. Some of these will be owned. They're not all owned. And by having an owner to pay for the infrastructure, the rules of that owner will introduce other licenses. So that's another factor on top of what you said. It's going to interact with what you said. And for Facebook, it seems that's, whatever those biases are, it seems very likely they'll be changing quite soon. So virality was a major bias. It really does seem they will take steps to in some way alter that. Regulate it, slow it down, take a closer look. They claim they hired, I think, 20,000 people to look at content. What those people do, how well it works, I really have no information, but it's an attempt to do something and change the rules of the game. But of course, you know, the people will game the new system in due time as well. So it's this ongoing, most institutions decay and get gamed, like tax systems or regulations, and it will be true for the simulations as it's somewhat true of science. So it's also a dynamic analysis. It's not just like, here are the rules of the game, basta. It's going to evolve.
What's the most important thing you've learned observing systems about what makes successful people who game the rules? What's the subversion aspect? What insight or heuristic do you have about successful subversion?
People aren't as good as I thought they were, like morally, would be the biggest thing I've learned. Seriously. It's a little depressing, and probably many of you have had similar experiences.
Okay. So I invite all of you to, okay, we'll take one last question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any examples in mind of places where some feature of a simulation gets propagated back to the real version?
Well, I believe it's hard to verify this, but I believe academics write more and more with media, blogs, and Twitter in mind. I certainly hear, often confidentially, many people telling me that in serious ways. I don't feel it's the kind of thing I could prove or establish, but I'm living in this world like very closely. I'm really pretty sure that's true.
Do you feel like there's some good feature of the blog version of academia that is now made it back into the non-blog version of academia?
Well, researchers care about the real world much more, and a number of sources deserve credit, but it's a major and really quite positive impact, especially in economics. I've seen a massive shift in the last 20 years, not only because of social media, but it's that part of it's almost completely positive. So anyway, thank you all for coming.
On that
if you ever want to follow up, email me.